The tranquil streets of Brentwood were suddenly disrupted by an unimaginable tragedy just days ago. At the heart of the horror was Romy Reiner, left shaking in the very home where she grew up. The place that once rang with joyful family moments now felt alien, chilling, quiet, and filled with dread. She stood paralyzed, breathless, as her gaze fell upon a scene that would scar her for life, her parents lying still and lifeless. Time appeared to halt entirely. When Los Angeles police arrived and verified the grim reality, Romy collapsed on the spot, overwhelmed by profound shock. She was quickly taken to the hospital, appearing ghostly pale, trembling, and struggling to form words. The only phrase she managed to utter, repeated urgently, was, "Catch Nick! Don't let him escape." Her desperate plea reverberated through the hospital corridors, raw with the anguish of someone whose entire world had shattered in an instant. After authorities announced Nick's arrest, Romy's physical condition gradually improved. Yet her thoughts remained trapped in that horrific moment, plagued by unrelenting guilt, terror, and vivid memories that refused to loosen their grip. Now, facing a barrage of media attention and relentless coverage, Romy has chosen to speak out for the first time. Her statement was deeply moving and profoundly shocking. She admitted to an unwitting involvement in the chain of events, a revelation that struck many harder than anticipated. The public reacted with stunned silence as she disclosed her own connection to the devastating occurrences that upended her existence. Shortly afterward, CBS News secured an exclusive interview that the public had eagerly anticipated. For the first time, the polished facade of the Reiner family began to fracture, exposing long-concealed truths hidden behind years of happy photographs and public smiles. On the afternoon of December 14th, as daylight dimmed outside her window, Romy received a message that turned her blood cold. Her parents weren't responding to calls. Instinctively, she sensed something catastrophic had occurred, and that her life was on the verge of irreversible change. Rob had finally reached his limit, the point where fury cools into icy resolve and every past kindness begins to feel like a snare. For years, he had been the one tidying up Nick's chaos, offering cover and justifications without fail. But this time, something inside him broke. He refused to rescue Nick again or even issue a heads up. Rob was finished being the steadfast ally. He intended to sever Nick from his life entirely. It began with one concise, cutting message. Rob composed it, paused to look at the screen, then pressed send. "We're done. Don't contact me again." On the surface, the words were straightforward, but they carried the full weight of accumulated fatigue and betrayal. Nick had overstepped far too often, and Rob refused to be pulled under once more. What Rob hadn't anticipated was the rapid unraveling that followed. Those in their circle noted that Rob's demeanor shifted dramatically overnight. He stopped taking calls, erased old pictures, and began probing into secrets Nick had guarded for years. Some speculated that Rob had uncovered something damning enough to destroy Nick completely. Others thought Rob had already acted decisively, fueling Nick's growing paranoia. He was constantly glancing behind him, on edge wherever he went. By the time Romy Reiner came forward with her bombshell account, rumors of the bitter rift between Rob and Nick were circulating rapidly. Online discussions exploded with speculation, shared screenshots, and purported private exchanges suggesting a deeper entanglement linking everyone involved. Then came the most startling claim, that Rob hadn't merely ended the friendship, he had devised a strategy to erase Nick's presence altogether, not just from his phone, but from every trace of their shared history. Insiders described Rob referring to it as a clean slate. Whatever his exact intentions, one fact stood out. Rob had no plans to look back. Soon after that decisive text, the bond between Rob and Nick disintegrated swiftly. Nick was stunned. The person he relied on most had turned utterly distant. He bombarded Rob with calls, messages, and even unannounced visits, but each effort met the same response: nothing. That silence carried a clear message. Rob was no longer pretending or hesitating. People close to the situation observed Nick descending into turmoil. He appeared unannounced in various Los Angeles locations, visibly agitated, obsessively checking his phone as though anticipating disaster. One source remarked that he seemed genuinely terrified, convinced something severe was closing in. Whatever Rob had discovered, it was grave enough to rob Nick of rest for days on end. All the while, Rob operated discreetly, perhaps too discreetly. He wasn't content with simply cutting ties. He was actively reshaping the narrative, removing files, reaching out to former associates, and scrubbing any digital connections between them. Some even alleged he had begun leaking anonymous leads to journalists, subtly revealing what had transpired behind the scenes. The online world seized on the drama, transforming the Rob-Nick fallout into one of the most talked-about enigmas in Hollywood that month. When Romy Reiner eventually stepped into the spotlight with her explosive revelations, her voice trembled when the camera rolled again and she spoke both their names. The pain and knowledge in her eyes told the whole story. This had long stopped being just a family matter. It was betrayal crashing head-on into buried secrets. She suggested that Rob's choice to completely wipe Nick out of his life wasn't merely personal vengeance. It was an act of protection, but protection from what exactly? No one had a clear answer. By the end of that week, the same question haunted every conversation. What did Rob know that made him disappear so abruptly? And if he was truly determined to erase Nick from existence, how extreme would he go to achieve it? The rift between Rob and Nick had crossed the point of no return. Anyone near them could sense the heavy atmosphere, a toxic blend of silence, distrust, and unspoken accusations that trailed them everywhere. Rob had disappeared from all the usual places. No more parties, no red carpets, no casual sightings. At the same time, Nick was sliding deeper into paranoia, convinced Rob was orchestrating something massive out of sight. Social media began lighting up with rumors. Screenshots circulated, supposed voice clips spread, cryptic posts appeared from throwaway accounts. One claimed Rob had met with a private security consultant. Another insisted he'd been quietly gathering evidence against Nick for months. Nothing was verified, yet each fresh rumor made the saga more tangled and addictive. People turned obsessive, zooming into years-old photographs, cross-checking timestamps, trying to reconstruct the real timeline of the friendship's collapse. Then an old video clip resurfaced, Rob and Nick laughing together at a charity gala just months before the explosion. In it, Rob stares straight into the lens and says calmly, "One day, people will know who you really are." That single offhand line electrified the internet. Was it playful banter, or had Rob been planting warnings long before anyone realized? Romy Reiner, meanwhile, found herself dragged further into the whirlwind. In her most recent interview, she confessed that both men had been far more entwined with her family than the public ever suspected. Rob wasn't simply furious, she said quietly. He was terrified, like he could see something enormous approaching. Those words shifted the entire narrative. What began as a personal falling out had grown into a gathering storm of loyalty tests, hidden truths, and calculated revenge, all simmering behind closed doors. Most unsettling of all, Rob had stayed completely silent in public since the split. Everyone was holding their breath for his next action, knowing it would be seismic whenever it came. Weeks passed with no word from him. That absence screamed louder than any press release could have. Nick, by contrast, was visibly crumbling. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a haunted, jumpy energy. He canceled appearances, avoided leaving the house, barely slept. Close contacts reported him repeating the same fear. "Rob's coming for me. He knows my time is up." Whispers circulated that Rob wasn't in hiding to escape. He was preparing. He'd gone dark, severed every visible tie, and was working on something major. Some swore they'd seen him in San Diego speaking with a high-profile attorney. Others insisted he was building a dossier capable of obliterating Nick's public image. True or not, the undercurrent was impossible to ignore. Romy Reiner's latest revelation poured fuel on the fire. Tearfully, she disclosed that Nick had once pressured her to stay silent about a family matter, and that Rob had discovered it. "That was the moment everything shifted," she said. "Rob didn't want payback. He wanted the truth exposed, no matter the cost." Headlines erupted. Online speculation went into overdrive about what Rob might release next. Public sympathy had reversed completely. Rob was no longer viewed as Nick's quiet sidekick. He was now seen as a determined whistleblower, exhausted by deception and ready to burn it all down. Online, he quickly earned the nickname The Eraser, and it spread like wildfire. No one knew his location or his exact plan. But one certainty hung in the air. When Rob finally surfaced, the impact would be devastating. By week 6, the anticipation had become unbearable. Every platform pulsed with the same question. Where is Rob, and what is he about to unleash? Tabloids and gossip accounts hunted every rumor, every grainy photo, every blind item. Some claimed he was living under an alias. Others said he'd been spotted near Nick's former studio after midnight. Nick's empire was collapsing in real time. His team clammed up. His publicist disappeared. One after another, his social accounts went silent. Then, for 5 fleeting minutes, a black square appeared with 3 words. He warned you. It vanished almost as quickly as it arrived, but the internet had already screenshot it and descended into chaos. Was that Rob's signal? Or was Nick desperately trying to preempt whatever bomb was about to drop? No one knew for certain, but the clock was clearly ticking down. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Then Romy Reiner stepped back into public view, dropping revelations that pushed the story into even more shocking territory. She confirmed that Rob had uncovered messages, clear evidence that Nick had been deceiving far more than just her. He wasn't simply lying, she said, her voice trembling. He was constructing an entirely different version of reality, and Rob was the only person left who could put an end to it. That single line exploded across every entertainment outlet within hours. After that came silence. Complete, unnerving silence. No more leaks, no fresh posts, only a heavy quiet that left everyone restless and on edge. People close to the situation whispered that Rob had vanished from sight to carry out what he called the final step. The phrase spread like wildfire online, igniting wild speculation. Was Rob preparing one massive career-ending revelation? Whatever he was planning, the tension was palpable across the city. Everyone could feel it. Something enormous was about to break. And when Rob finally acted, nothing would ever be the same. Weeks passed before another layer of Rob's strategy began to emerge, one no one had anticipated. The rumors about erasing Nick weren't just about ending a friendship. They were about containment. Rob had discreetly begun contacting treatment professionals and specialists, discussing how Nick's behavior required serious, long-term intervention. To the outside world, it looked like genuine worry, like a man trying to save someone he once loved from self-destruction. But behind the scenes, his plan carried a far darker purpose. According to sources close to Rob, he had arranged a placement in a remote, low-profile recovery facility, far from Los Angeles, far from the media, far from everything. He quietly told a handful of people it was the only way to help Nick get clean and rebuild. But the reality was colder. Rob had no intention of Nick ever returning. This wasn't rehabilitation. It was permanent removal. A carefully orchestrated exile designed to purge the disruption Nick had brought into so many lives. Romy, still shaken from her own trauma, later shared that Rob had confided in her shortly before the situation spiraled. He told me he was finished protecting Nick, she recalled. He wanted calm. He wanted the chaos to end. Those words carried a very different weight once people understood what Rob's version of help truly meant. Then came the twist no one expected. Nick began to sense that something was deeply wrong. He noticed Rob growing distant, secretive, unnaturally composed, like someone who had already made up his mind and taken irreversible steps. Nick was far from naive. One person close to him said he could feel the shift. He knew Rob was orchestrating something behind his back. That realization changed everything. What had started as Rob's private mission to quietly remove Nick from their world quietly transformed into a silent, simmering conflict between 2 men who had once considered each other family. The atmosphere grew thick with unspoken hostility, and the same question haunted everyone who knew the truth. What would Nick do once he fully understood what Rob was planning? As Rob's arrangement neared completion, the air between the 2 men became suffocating. Rob stayed careful, measured voice, calm demeanor, acting as though nothing had changed. He spoke to Nick about a private retreat where he could heal and begin again. On the surface, it sounded like kindness. Beneath it lay Rob's final farewell, already signed and sealed. Nick, however, wasn't deceived. Something in Rob's tone felt wrong, too polished, too final. The same man who once pleaded with him to stay out of trouble now sounded like someone who wanted him gone forever. Friends who witnessed them together noticed the change in Nick's expression. Sharper, colder, always watching, always waiting for the mask to slip. One close associate recalled Nick muttering, "He thinks he can just ship me off like I'm nothing. He's not getting rid of me that easily." Those words sent a shiver through everyone who heard them. All the while, Rob continued the performance, smiling, reassuring, quietly finalizing travel arrangements and program details. He even booked the flight, promising Nick everything would be handled privately and professionally. Inside, though, Rob was drained. He believed that once Nick disappeared from their lives, peace would finally return, to Romy, to their circle, to everyone caught in the wreckage. But the story was already veering toward a darker ending. Nick had no intention of going quietly. The more he dwelled on Rob's plan, the more trapped and betrayed he felt. What Rob viewed as salvation, Nick saw as banishment. And then, just when it seemed Rob's carefully constructed exit strategy was about to succeed, Nick made a move no one saw coming. What happened next would rattle Brentwood once again, turning Rob's meticulous plan into a devastating, irreversible tragedy. On the final night before Nick was scheduled to leave, the house felt strangely still. Too still. Rob had kept the atmosphere deliberately light, talking about fresh starts, recovery, new chances. He even prepared dinner, trying to create one last illusion of normalcy, as though the months of unraveling could be smoothed over with a meal. But beneath every casual word lay tension so thick it was nearly unbearable. Rob believed he had everything under control. He believed Nick had accepted the plan. But Nick's silence wasn't acceptance. It was something else entirely. Later that night, Nick slipped away for several hours without a single word. When he returned, his expression had changed. His eyes were distant, hollow, and unnervingly focused. Rob didn't pick up on it immediately, but Romy later recalled receiving a message from him that evening. In hindsight, it felt like a quiet alarm. She remembered thinking his calmness seemed unnatural, as though he had already reached an irreversible decision. While the night wore on, Rob sat alone at his desk, reviewing every detail of the travel arrangements one final time. The ticket, the forged papers, the name and address of the clinic, everything aligned flawlessly. In his mind, he was finally bringing order to years of turmoil, doing what had to be done. What he failed to realize was that Nick had already pieced it all together. He had discovered the documents, the encrypted messages, the booking confirmation. Undeniable evidence that Rob wasn't trying to rescue him. He was trying to erase him. Something inside Nick broke that night. The accumulated rage, humiliation, and suspicion finally erupted. Neighbors later reported hearing raised voices, a loud crash, then an abrupt, heavy silence. No one yet understood what had unfolded inside those walls, but by dawn, another tragedy had visited the Reiner household. As sirens cut through the pre-dawn stillness of Brentwood, the same question echoed among everyone who knew the family. If Rob had been truthful from the beginning, if he hadn't tried to act as both savior and judge, would any of this have come to pass? By morning, the elegant streets of Brentwood were once again alive with flashing red and blue lights. Police vehicles lined the curb outside the Reiner home. Word traveled quickly. Something horrific had happened, worse than anyone had feared. The neighborhood that had once celebrated the family now buzzed with stunned whispers and disbelief. Inside the house, investigators moved carefully through a scene of sudden violence. Scattered documents, ripped open suitcases, overturned chairs. Nothing about it looked premeditated. The eerie calm that had preceded the night had detonated without warning. Hours later, when Rob regained consciousness in the hospital, his first rasped words chilled the detectives beside him. He knew. Nick knew everything. Those few syllables told the entire story of discovery, betrayal, terror, and chaos. Nick had learned the full scope of Rob's plan and transformed it into something no one could have anticipated. Outside the hospital, Romy stood trembling before the cameras. Her voice broke as she managed only a few words. Rob was trying to make things right, but it all went terribly wrong. She said nothing more, but the grief and regret in her eyes spoke volumes. She had sensed the mounting strain, yet she never imagined it would end in catastrophe. As the investigation deepened, the fragments began to form a grim picture. The secret messages, the one-way plane ticket, the clinic paperwork, Every piece confirmed the same disturbing reality. Rob's attempt to quietly remove Nick from his life had detonated in the most devastating way possible. With journalists swarming and public speculation growing feverish, one question dominated every news cycle. Had Rob's decision to solve the problem driven Nick over the edge, or had disaster been inevitable all along? The emerging truth appeared far uglier than anyone had expected, and the full story was clearly far from finished. In the days that followed, the Reiner case consumed every headline and conversation. Reporters staked out the hospital hoping for a glimpse of Rob. Television loops replayed the same stark images: emergency lights, yellow tape, and Romy's tear-streaked face frozen in anguish. The public demanded answers, but the truth remained knotted in secrets known only to a handful of people. Behind the scenes, detectives reconstructed those final hours. They uncovered several calls Rob had placed late that night. One to the private clinic, one to his attorney, and one final unanswered call to Romy. That missed call quickly became a central enigma. Online forums buzzed with theories. What had he intended to confess, to warn her about? Rob remained silent, still too fragile or too guarded to explain. Nick, meanwhile, had vanished completely. No trace, no sightings that could be verified. A few neighbors thought they'd seen him walking toward the coast. Others swore he must have left well before first light. In the end, he had simply evaporated, carrying every remaining answer with him. Still shaken and hollowed out, Romy issued a brief public statement expressing hope that the full truth would soon emerge. Her carefully chosen words only intensified the mystery, suggesting layers to the story that no one outside the family yet understood. As fresh evidence continued to surface and public attention tightened, the narrative quietly began to shift. Perhaps this wasn't merely a tale of betrayal and retaliation. Perhaps it was something more primal, a desperate collision between two people, each convinced, right up until the final moment, that they were acting to survive. The situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone expected. One fact remained undeniable: the full truth still lay hidden. And when it finally surfaced, it promised to leave everyone reeling. A week passed with no trace of Nick. The city buzzed with unease. News crews camped outside the precinct. Fans flooded every comment section with increasingly outlandish theories, and tabloids churned out competing narratives about that fateful night. Yet beneath the clamor, investigators worked methodically, quietly zeroing in on a breakthrough that could upend the entire story. While examining Rob's phone and laptop, detectives recovered several deleted voice messages, all from Nick. The recordings were raw, charged with anguish and desperation. In one particularly haunting clip, Nick's voice cracked as he said, "You're not saving me, Rob. You're burying me." Those 9 words rippled through the investigation like ice water. For the first time, the picture sharpened. Nick hadn't merely felt betrayed, he felt ensnared, cornered, and pushed to the edge of retaliation. Romy was summoned for another round of questioning. What she disclosed stunned the room. She explained that, in the days leading up to the incident, Rob had spoken cryptically about making arrangements that would finally bring peace. She had interpreted it as a step toward reconciliation, not exile. Tears streaming, she whispered, "If I had understood what he truly intended, I would have stopped him." Her words shifted the public narrative overnight. Meanwhile, amateur sleuths online kept excavating. They pieced together photos, timestamps, and fragments of messages suggesting Nick himself had been making preparations, something extreme. A handful of posters even insisted he had left behind a final statement, hidden in a place no one had yet thought to check. The saga had grown uncontainable. It was no longer simply a public falling out between two brothers. It had become a tangled web of manipulation, crossed wires, and a cascade of decisions that ended in catastrophe. With police now signaling an imminent major development, the world held its breath, waiting for the remaining pieces to lock into place, and dreading the possibility that the completed picture would rewrite everything people believed about Rob, Nick, and the tragedy that fractured the Reiner family forever. Tension still hung heavy over Brentwood, thicker with each passing day. Something fundamental inside the Reiner household had splintered, yet the depth of that fracture remained concealed from the outside world. Authorities had downgraded the incident to a domestic disturbance and pulled back, but those closest to the family murmured that the official label was dangerously understated. There were bruises that hadn't made the report, shattered glass quietly swept away, and hushed sobs that spoke louder than any statement. Romy withdrew from public view, trying to hold herself together amid the online storm. Headlines offered every possible angle. Some insisted Rob and Nick had quietly made peace. Others described another explosive confrontation that ended in pandemonium. Reality, as usual, lay somewhere in the messy middle. Rob was back home attempting to project normalcy, but insiders said he barely closed his eyes at night. Friends noticed how he constantly scanned his surroundings, as though waiting for an ambush that had not yet arrived. Nick, by contrast, had gone quiet. Too quiet. He ignored calls, yet sightings trickled in. Alone at corner tables in dimly lit cafes, cruising empty streets after midnight, checking into hotels under assumed names. He seemed to be keeping his distance while still remaining just close enough to observe. The anger had drained from him, one acquaintance confided. What replaced it was an eerie composure that unnerved everyone far more than any outburst ever could. Romy's friends urged her to leave the city for a while, to breathe, but she refused. "I can't walk away from my own family," she told one of them in a low voice. She still clung to the fragile hope that things could be repaired, that Nick might accept help before the point of no return. Yet deep down she knew, whatever had shifted inside Nick was permanent. While the wider world dismissed it as another messy celebrity family quarrel, those who truly understood the Reiners could sense the real danger. The storm hadn't passed. It was only gathering strength, and this time, it carried the threat of something irreversible. Days later, the fragile stillness cracked again. Rob ventured out for a brief, carefully staged appearance, telling a handful of reporters that the situation had been exaggerated, just a private family issue blown wildly out of proportion. His smile looked painted on. His voice wavered. His eyes darted as though expecting an unseen figure to step into frame at any moment. To those present, he didn't appear relieved. He looked hunted. Nick's absence only amplified his presence. Though no one had spoken to him directly in days, unsettling anecdotes began circulating. One neighbor swore she saw his car idling down the block after dark, lights extinguished, for hours. Another reported glimpsing him standing motionless near the family gate late at night, staring at the house before melting back into the shadows. Police dismissed the accounts as rumor. To those who knew Nick's patterns, though, the stories felt not only plausible but deeply ominous. Romy, caught between dread and fading hope, kept dialing his number. Nick stopped answering. Call after call went straight to voicemail, greeted each time by the same flat, mechanical voice that seemed to grow more distant and impersonal with every unanswered ring. Eventually, Romy gave up on the phone and began writing him letters she knew she would never mail. In one, she wrote simply, "You don't have to keep battling us. Just come back." Even as the words went onto the page, she realized she no longer knew what back or home really meant. By then, the pretense had crumbled. Friends and relatives no longer bothered with reassuring smiles or optimistic small talk. The strain was too obvious. A thickening sense of anger, betrayal, and unbroken silence settled over everyone like a lowering ceiling. As Christmas lights began twinkling across Brentwood, the Reiner house remained completely dark. Its windows threw back only blank night. In quiet conversations, people kept returning to the same uneasy questions. Where was Nick? What was he waiting for? The holidays brought no comfort, only an unnatural hush that seemed to coil tighter around the property. To outsiders, the street looked cheerfully decorated, yet neighbors swore the atmosphere near that particular house felt wrong, dense, charged, almost expectant. Rob rarely ventured beyond the gate anymore. On the few occasions he did, he took short, stiff circuits around the block, glancing over his shoulder every few steps as though certain someone was watching. Inside, the mood was no lighter. Romy tried to keep up appearances, setting up a modest tree in the living room corner and arranging a few ornaments as though routine could force normalcy. The quiet was suffocating. Rob spent long hours shut in his study, staring at an unresponsive phone, dodging any real conversation. Not once since that final night had Nick reached out. No call, no message, nothing. Yet his absence never felt like true disappearance. One night, Romy heard faint crunching footsteps on the gravel drive, then the soft groan of the side gate. Her pulse stopped. She peered through the curtains into solid black and saw nothing. When she told Rob, he dismissed it as nerves, but his face went ashen when he pulled up the security feed and discovered one camera had gone entirely dark. The following morning, a neighbor casually mentioned spotting the old familiar sedan parked a block away again, the car Nick used to drive. Rob said nothing, but Romy recognized raw fear in his expression, no longer mixed with anger, only dread. The atmosphere had unmistakably changed. A brittle stillness hung over the house, the kind that precedes something irreversible. Nick was somewhere close, silent and patient, and no one could guess when or how he would finally act. One certainty loomed: the fragile calm Rob had fought to maintain was about to break apart for good. December 14th became the date Brentwood would never forget. That night the air felt frozen, as though the entire city held its breath. Inside the Reiner house, weeks of mounting pressure finally snapped. Later, neighbors recalled hearing voices, not wild shouting, but low, intense arguing that continued for almost an hour before everything stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to devour sound itself. No one knows exactly what happened behind those walls. What is known is that by morning the house had been transformed. The warm, lively home, once filled with holiday meals, laughter, and family routines, had turned hollow and frigid. Rob and Michelle were gone. The life they had carefully constructed vanished in a single night. It was Romy who found them. She had tried calling her parents repeatedly with no success. When she arrived and discovered the front door unlocked, a sick wrongness hit her the moment she crossed the threshold. Too quiet, too motionless. Her shaky voice calling, "Mom? Dad?" met only emptiness. Then she saw them, and everything inside her locked. The scream that tore out of her shattered the stillness that had blanketed the house since the night before. Police secured the scene quickly. Romy was taken to the hospital, pale and disoriented, struggling to form coherent sentences. Investigators soon established there had been no forced entry. The person responsible had been allowed inside. That realization turned the investigation in its most chilling direction. Evidence rapidly pointed to Nick. He was not missing. He was not in hiding. When officers located him, he was sitting quietly in a modest Brentwood hotel room, perfectly still, face blank, as though nothing of consequence had occurred. The community that once embraced the Reiners now reeled in shock and revulsion, everyone asking the same terrible question: what could have pushed Nick Reiner to this point? When police entered the room that morning, they found him perched on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the opposite wall. The television flickered silently, curtains blocked out the daylight, and on the nightstand sat his phone, a partially drunk glass of water, and a small pile of family photographs. He offered no resistance, no protest, no visible surprise. One officer later said he looked hollow, physically present, but emotionally absent. In the bathroom, they discovered blood. Near the sink and on a towel by the door lay traces that would eventually link back to the scene at the Reiner residence. Yet Nick displayed no visible reaction, no fear, no distress, no bewilderment. When officers read him his Miranda rights, he gave only a quiet nod. Asked if he understood them, he murmured a soft, "Yes." Nothing more. No justifications, no protests. At the hospital, Romy, still reeling from shock, was informed later that day that her brother was in custody. Her response shattered those around her. There were no sobs or outbursts. She simply gazed blankly at the wall and whispered, "He wouldn't hurt them. He wouldn't." Deep inside, though, a part of her already sensed the unbearable reality. The investigation accelerated from there. Detectives reconstructed the timeline. Nick had left the family home late that night and checked into a nearby hotel just a few miles away. Security cameras captured him arriving alone, composed, still dressed in the same outfit he'd worn earlier that evening. When the news exploded, the public struggled to process it. Nick Reiner, the once promising, charismatic son of Hollywood icons, now occupied the heart of an unimaginable horror. As coverage flooded every outlet across the country, one haunting question lingered unanswered. Why? What had unfolded in those final hours inside the Reiner home? What words passed between them before everything shattered? The answers hovered near, yet remained just beyond grasp. In the weeks after the tragedy, Romy vanished from public life entirely. Reporters staked out her home, hungry for any statement or sighting, but she offered nothing. No comments, no appearances. Many assumed grief had silenced her, and in truth it had. Behind closed doors, however, a quiet transformation was underway. Her silence stemmed not only from sorrow, but from introspection. She began sifting through memories, revisiting conversations, and examining overlooked warning signs. She pored over old texts from Nick, replayed voicemails from her father, and studied family photographs that now felt less like keepsakes and more like evidence. The truth, she would later reflect, had been visible all along. She simply hadn't wanted to face it. Each revelation stung more sharply. Small deceptions, concealed conflicts, subtle indications of how deeply fractured the family had become. The polished image they projected had always concealed cracks. What ultimately compelled her to break her silence was intensely personal, not external pressure from police or press. It was a letter she discovered hidden in her father's study, written only a week before December 14th. In it, Rob expressed a longing to repair the damage and liberate the family from turmoil. To an outsider, it might read as a father's earnest effort to mend things. To Romy, it unveiled the full picture. The concealed plan, the mounting dread, the frantic bid to protect Nick by sending him away. That letter marked her turning point. For days she wrestled with what to do. Then, one evening while rereading her father's words, she understood that continued silence would only prolong the suffering. The world deserved clarity. As she later explained in an interview, she spoke not to assign blame, but to allow her family to finally find peace. With that decision, Romy chose to reveal the complete story. Her father's intentions, Nick's unraveling, and the sequence of choices that transformed devotion into devastation. It was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of release. For the first time since that terrible night, she felt prepared to speak. When Romy eventually re-emerged publicly, the anticipation was palpable. Months had passed since the tragedy, and speculation ran rampant. Would she defend her brother, denounce him, or simply clarify the gaps everyone had filled with guesses? She did it on her own terms, quietly, deliberately. The interview took place in a gentle, low-lit room. No theatrics, no elaborate staging, just Romy facing the journalist, her hands betraying a faint tremble as recording began. Her voice remained steady, yet laden with feeling. "This isn't a tale of monsters," she opened. "It's the story of people who lost their path." The room fell hushed. Every sentence carried raw honesty and deep pain. She recounted the days before December 14th, how an unease had settled over her, though she hadn't known how to intervene. "We were both trying to save him," she said, her voice catching. "But we didn't see that he didn't need saving. He needed to be understood." She spoke of her father's letter, the burdens he bore, and the regret that haunted him. Then she addressed Nick, not as a villain, but as a person shattered by fear, addiction, and isolation. "He wasn't furious with us," she said quietly. "He was adrift. And when someone who's lost feels trapped, they can do things that can't be taken back." The broadcast aired that night. By morning, it had reached millions. Some praised her courage, others believed she was safeguarding her brother's legacy. Nearly everyone, however, recognized one truth. Her account reframed the entire Reiner tragedy. Chaos gained context, rage found its origins, and beneath the horror lay something painfully human. The headlines gradually shifted from sensationalism to something more human. The Reiner tragedy stopped feeling like just another tabloid Hollywood story. It began to feel real, raw, and painfully personal. Even after the cameras switched off, one question refused to fade. Was Romy telling the complete truth, or only the version she could bear to live with? After that single, explosive interview, Romy Reiner's life changed forever. The long silence that had shielded her family finally shattered, unleashing a torrent of reactions she could never have anticipated. Her inbox overflowed with interview requests. Podcasts analyzed every pause and every word. Social media erupted into fierce arguments about responsibility, loyalty, and legacy. Some hailed her as brave, a woman who finally gave voice to years of buried pain. Others accused her of selective memory, of polishing ugly facts to preserve her brother's image. Romy never answered the critics. She had spoken what she needed to speak. Now she simply wanted quiet. Yet beneath her composed exterior, the burden never really lifted. The Brentwood house was sold, the boxes were packed, but the echoes of that December night traveled with her. She'd catch herself staring at strangers who carried a faint resemblance to Nick, or hearing her father's voice in the stillness before sunrise. Late at night, she would replay the interview in her mind, questioning whether she had truly told the truth, or only the part that didn't destroy her. There was one detail she had kept private. Folded inside her father's final letter was a small, separate note written just to her. It read simply, "If you ever feel lost, tell the story. It's the only way to find your way home." Those words became her anchor. Telling became her path through grief, even when every retelling reopened the wound. Through interviews, handwritten letters, and solitary midnight writing, she slowly shaped the chaos into coherence, a story that could transform sorrow into something closer to understanding. As another winter arrived and the anniversary drew near, Romy realized one last chapter remained. Not a chapter of blame or absolution, but of what follows survival. Because in the end, this was never only a story of loss. It was a story of what happens when love, shame, guilt, and decades of silence collide, and whether truth can ever truly release its prisoners. A full year had passed since that night in December. The news cycle had long since moved on, the cameras disappeared. But for Romy, healing was only just beginning. She had learned not to run from the weight of the truth, but to carry it with a kind of hard-earned grace. The public no longer saw her simply as the daughter left behind. They saw a woman who found the courage to speak when silence might have been easier and safer. In a small, unscripted interview months later, she sat on a quiet stretch of beach with no lights, no crew, only the rhythm of the ocean behind her. Her voice was soft but steady. "I used to believe this was a story about everything we lost," she said, "but now I see it's really about love. The complicated, imperfect, deeply human kind. My family is gone, but the lessons they left are still right here." A small, bittersweet smile crossed her face. Her eyes held both grief and a fragile peace. If telling our story helps even one person pick up the phone and ask for help, then every difficult word was worth it. Her quiet message reached millions. The Reiner tragedy was no longer framed as just another Hollywood heartbreak. It had become something larger, a reflection for anyone who has ever wrestled with family secrets, guilt, shame, or the fear of speaking. Romy's willingness to face the truth turned devastation into something unexpectedly redemptive. As the screen faded to black, a final line appeared. "The truth cannot undo what happened, but it can light the path ahead. And if this story touched you, don't scroll past in silence. Like, subscribe. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below. Do you think Romy was right to break the silence? Or are some family truths better left undisturbed forever? Because sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones we finally find the courage to tell.